Hi, this is Steve Rigolosi, and tonight on Forgotten Mysteries, I have for you The Rattle Rat by Janwillem van de Wetering. So how is that for a mouthful of a last name? Janwillem was a Dutchman. He traveled the world extensively throughout his life and spent his final years in America, in Maine. And this cover is actually, if you look closely, rather gruesome, but it does convey a sense of what's in the book. It takes place partially in Amsterdam. You can see the canals and the buildings. And this is a copyright 1985 by Pantheon. So, where do I begin? I had been wanting to read him for a while. A pretty good friend of mine loves his books and recommended them to me. They never really quite felt like they would be my cup of tea based on the way he described them to me. But I thought, it's time. And it's always nice to read a mystery writer who is not American or English. It's interesting to get, those different perspectives. And you really do get that in this book. I'll go into that in a bit. So those of you who are familiar with or are not familiar with this series know that it is, there are sort of 3 or 4 main characters who run throughout the books. The lead detectives are, there are 2 lead detectives. There's their boss, the commissaris, who really doesn't have a last name. He's only ever referred to as Jan. And then there is a 4th detective, Simon Cardozo, who is Jewish. And is actually a really cool character because he looks sort of so nondescript and non-threatening, but he is a martial artist and he's really tough. So, people think that they're going to run roughshod over Cardozo. That's a bad mistake because he will kick their asses. You all know I keep this channel pretty low tech, and I don't usually have visual aids, but I did create a visual aid for this book because it takes place in the Netherlands, and the names are Dutch, which are not easy to really wrap your head around if you're a native speaker of English, because the spellings are just not what we English speakers are used to. So I made a guide for myself, which I'm going to share with you, because I feel like, how can I go through a book if I really don't know how the characters' names are pronounced? So here is my cheat sheet for you. Okay, the 2 main characters are Henk Grijpstra and Rinus de Gier. As you can see, that's not really how their names are spelled, right? This is how they're spelled in the book. And I can only imagine how I would have mangled these names if I did not look up the pronunciations. It takes place, much of the book takes place in a province called Friesland, which actually looks pretty much in English the way it does in Dutch. The victim's name is Douwe Scherhuun. You can see that's not easy to pronounce. And there is a sort of a love interest there named Hilkje. And this is how her name is spelled. So I will be using in this video the proper names or the proper pronunciations of these characters, because it feels like the right thing to do. If I'm going to talk about characters, I should pronounce their names right. So each of these characters is pretty differentiated. Grijpstra is he's an adjutant, and that's a pretty high title in the police force. And he is divorced and a little cranky and a little philosophical. And then De Gier is younger. He's a ladies' man. He's a bit of a nihilist and a Zen Buddhist. And so he pontificates a lot about sort of philosophical issues. Cardozo is sort of probably the most comedic of the characters, in that he lives with his kind of annoying to him Jewish family, and there's some good comedy there. And then the commissaris is actually, he's a gentleman and a very smart man. He suffers from some condition, rheumatism, arthritis, something. He's not in the peak of health, but he's a good thinker and a gentleman, and he is the boss of Grijpstra and Gier. So what I really found the most interesting about this book was its setting. Apparently, I had never heard this before. There is a province, there's a part of the Netherlands, the northern part of the country, called Friesland. And Friesland is a lot like, I mean, they're rather separatist, kind of like the Basque country in Spain, Quebec, how they every so often start rattling their chains that they want independence from Canada. Scotland, Scotland has had separatist tendencies for, centuries now, but they ultimately decided to stay in the UK and the European Union. And, these, what they all share is this really very strong culture that they want to preserve, and a language that they want to preserve, and traditions that they want to preserve. They don't want to assimilate. They want to be on their own. But what most of them just don't want to realize is that economically they couldn't really survive. They need the larger political state to which they already belong to survive economically. Excuse me. But when nationalistic or regional feelings get stirred up, that often does not enter the equation. So the Frieslanders, they speak their own language, kind of a variation of Dutch with quite a bit of German and even some English in it. And when you cross the dike and you end up in Friesland, you feel, or the author makes you feel, like you have really entered into a separate realm. Amsterdam is portrayed as, very seedy and very dirty, with its red light districts and its crime. It doesn't make Amsterdam seem like the place you would want to visit. In contrast, Friesland is like almost picture perfect. Every house is well kept. There are beautiful flowers everywhere. You could lick the sidewalks and be fine. And the people have a very strong sense of themselves as Frieslanders. And that plays a pretty strong role in the book, because they do look down their nose at the rest of the Netherlands. They consider themselves somewhat superior and aren't even subtle about it. They say that. They talk about, well, we have no crime down here. Any bad people we have here in Friesland know that they're going to have to go down into Amsterdam and other parts of the country to make trouble, because we just won't put up with it here. So it's a little bit idyllic, but what von de Wetering shows is that there is, that they have the same problems that people have everywhere, right? There's marital discord and a little bit of unhappiness and adultery, cheating on spouses, so there's maybe this front of quasi-perfection, but it's really not perfect. The Frieslanders are extremely resentful of taxation. I mean, European taxation, it makes America look like, a tax-free zone. They're just taxed to death there. And the Frieslanders, they do all of their transactions in cash. They keep their savings in gold. They everything, to the extent possible, is done off the books to hide money from the tax man. Just because they think, we spend all of our tax, we give all this tax money away, and what benefit do we get from it? Nothing. We're going to support drug addicts in Amsterdam, and we're not going to put up with that if we don't have to. So again, a very strong culture there that Van der Wetering portrays really nicely. I like books about these kind of micro cultures. Like one here in the U.S. might be sort of like the Amish or the Mennonites. Very interesting to get into a community that I had never really heard of before. In fact, there's an interesting community even quite close to where I live, the Ramapo Indians, which are an interesting racial mixture. But I won't get into that because we're not talking about that right now. So the way the book starts, the plot starts, is that this Douwe Skurjoen is found dead in Amsterdam. He's basically been put into a small boat, shot through the head, and lit on fire. And, he's floating out in the boat, and, people on the mainland see the flames. They figure out, who he is through dental records. And then our Amsterdam-based cops have to go up to Friesland to begin to investigate the crime. And two of them, Grijpstra and the commissaris, were both born in Friesland, so they know the culture there, and they are kind of the best fit to understand what's going on. Cardozo, of course, is not, and neither is De Heer. So they go up to the Friesland and they begin investigating, and they uncover some truths that are hidden in Friesland, and they kind of go back and forth between Friesland and Amsterdam, and you're immersed in this culture of Friesland, and as if it's not foreign enough, right? Geographically, it seems to be set up so that any outsider will get lost no matter where they try to go. The roads are rings with, these weird spurs, and it's just like and they take pride in that, right? They don't want, a lot of people from the South coming up and ruining their society. They want people to, bad people, stay where you are. You're not welcome here. But the police up there are very, very cooperative. What I learned from this book is that there are it seems like there's a lot of different layers of police work at different regional levels there in the Netherlands. And they're all very careful about not treading on each other's toes or stepping into each other's territory. And it's kind of funny. Our detectives are constantly getting lost up there, and they're having to be rescued and driven from point to point by the police up there because they just can't get anywhere without getting lost. That's kind of funny. And that's the main plot of the book. So with that background said, let me give you my impressions of the book. And they're kind of mixed. The first thing I would say is I did not find this book to be an easy read. It required a lot of my attention and a lot of very close care paid to the words on the page, because the writing is rather heavy, sometimes dense, sometimes philosophical, and of course all those Dutch names don't really help unless you can really put yourself into that mindset, which is why I looked up how to pronounce all their names, so it would make the reading experience a little bit easier. There doesn't seem to be any real urgency about the investigation. The police kind of wander around Friesland and question some people, and everybody finds out that the murdered man was just a horrible person. a thief, a liar, a usurer, loaned out money at, a 30% interest rate, like some Dutch mafioso. And it just was, people knew that he was a bad egg. He had a nice wife whom he didn't treat very well. And people say, well, of course, he had to go down to Amsterdam to get killed because that's where things happen in our country. That can't happen here. And it's hard to really see any urgency about figuring out who did this because they're kind of like, what, good riddance to bad rubbish. We didn't need this dude in our country. But, they're the members of the murder investigation squad and they have to do their jobs. But there's no urgency about it, right? There's one person in particular who is a very important person in terms of establishing an alibi. And they don't get around to interviewing her until maybe the last 60 pages of the book. And I kept saying to myself, why are you not interviewing her? Why is she not tops on your priority list? Well, it's because, they'd rather sit at the bar and have a couple drinks. There's apparently a Dutch or a Frieslander drink called Genever, which is sort of a Dutch gin. They love drinking that, and they love sort of sitting around, smoking, and philosophizing. There's a lot of philosophizing in this book, to the point where it really, in my opinion, becomes too much. It interferes with the plot. It interferes with moving things forward. And I would say that some of those conversations aren't that interesting, but they kind of take you far afield from where you're oriented to be or where you want to be. And you kind of are like, all right, come on, let's get on with it. There's a German writer, Hakan Nesser, who has a similar approach in his books where there's not a lot of urgency about the investigation. And I think for building suspense, you do want that urgency, and you don't really have that here. Once the police find out what's going on, they get to the bottom of the case, and it's all fine. Gier is sort of brought along. It's sort of odd. They don't really want him taking part in the investigation, but they want to just sort of send him out into Friesland to observe and to pick up local information and to report on things. And in the course of doing that, he comes across some good information that does help the crime get solved. But he's there almost as a spectator, which, I kind of found a little odd that they would not make use of his expertise and just let him cat around, which is what he does. I mean, he's apparently a very handsome man, and the Dutch are like these giants. I mean, I don't know if you've known many Dutch people, but the guys are like crazy tall, like 6'5", 6'6" is not uncommon. And so he finds a local policewoman that he wants to hook up with, and he's just generally considered to be this studly guy. And Cardozo feels a little bit like an add-on. He's not really used much in terms of the plot of this book, but he's sort of the most entertaining to read about because of his family life. Grijpstra is divorced because he's a bit of an old crank, and Gier is not married and is committed to remaining unpartnered and unmarried for the rest of his life. He's got definitely some male chauvinist tendencies about him. And there is some of that in here. Some feminist readers will definitely wince a little bit about some of the things that are said in here about women. But it was, the mid-'80s, so you have to kind of take that into account. Interestingly, probably my favorite character in the book was the titular character of the Rattle Rat, who is actually a rat named Eddie. And Eddie is the pet rat of the police policeman whose house our detectives are staying in. This policeman, Oppenheiser, is off elsewhere at his house in the country, and he volunteers use of his house, but the detectives have to take care of his pet rat, Eddie. And I know this may sound kind of gross, right? But I don't know if any of you have ever known anybody who's had a pet rat. They're actually really cute and really smart and playful and adorable. I mean, rats are really cool creatures. We're used to thinking of them as, spreading bubonic plague and, roaming the streets of Manhattan in packs and, just being filthy, disgusting creatures. But when you get to know them individually, they're super fun. It's almost like having a little miniature dog. They're like I said, they're really cute if you can get over the fact that they're a rodent. And Eddie is a character in this book, and anytime he's on the page, you're just smiling because he's so much fun, and the detectives like him so much. And he's called the Rattle Rat because he's basically asthmatic, and so he just kind of rattles a lot, and they're concerned about his health throughout the book. And he's even used in a very bizarre way in an effort to uncover information about the murderer or the suspects, but I won't get into that. But it's bizarre, not particularly effective as a method that the police are using, but bizarre. And I can almost guarantee you've never seen anything like this done before. So, I guess if you're an animal lover, Eddie will appeal to you. And if you don't like rodents, Eddie may just change your feeling about rats and other rodents. Although you will never get me to love squirrels. Never in a million years. They are constantly trying to destroy my house. So I have no love for squirrels. But rats, after reading about Eddie, I could see myself with a little pet. I mean, there's like the one friend I had who had a rat. The rat would just sit on his desk all day long and just keep him company and, want to have his belly scratched occasionally and give him a little piece of cheese. His name, I can't remember what the rat's name was, but that's beside the point. Anyway, so the Rattle Rat is very much a part of this book and its plot. But like I said, not particularly fast-moving. The characters don't, because they're a little cranky, the two main ones, they're not particularly fun to hang out with. The Commissaris is a much nicer character, and like I said, Cardozo is kind of fun. But between these two cranky leads and thick writing that is philosophical and discursive and not particularly well paced, I found that my attention waned quite a bit. Sometimes I had to force myself to stay focused on the page. The book's only, I think, about 300 pages? Yeah, it's a little bit under 300 pages. It felt longer to me because it required so much attention. And I'm not really sure that I feel like it was worth it to have to pay so much attention. Sometimes you have to slow down for a book, but you think, oh, that was worth it. With this, my feeling was just get on with it. So, and I think that is kind of a characteristic of this series in general. So the pros are Eddie the Rat, the setting, the learning about this aspect of Dutch culture. The cons are the sort of heaviness of the prose, a lack of suspense, digressions that feel not really necessary to the book. So if this sounds like your cup of tea, please give it a try. And if there are any fans here of Janwillem van Wetering, please tell us what you like about him. Share your thoughts about any of his other books. The last thing I'll say, and you could stop watching here because I'm basically done, is that I used to live in a town, actually for many years, that had a very large Dutch population. So I'm Italian by heritage. We don't have a lot in common with the Dutch. And when I lived in that town, I always felt like I was living a little bit in the Twilight Zone. The houses are very much like they're described in this book. Everybody is very, very house proud, and beautiful gardens and tulips and cleanliness. But the people were just so different culturally from me. Like, not Italians are we're loud and we're friendly and we're boisterous, and they really were not. And there was a Dutch Reformed church in the neighborhood that occasionally sent me recruitment letters. And I have to tell you, why anyone would join that church is a mystery to me. I'm Catholic and grew up in a parish where, love and kindness and goodness to your neighbors were all emphasized. But these recruitment letters from the Dutch Reformed Church were all about, sin and hell, and humans cannot be redeemed, and, we're all lower than dirt, and we need to accept that and just hope we can, get by on this planet because we're such sinful creatures. So, not the most humanistic message you can get from a church. And needless to say, I had no desire and did not join that church. But reading this book gave me insight into my old town, my old neighborhood. And I thought, aha, if I had read this book then, I would have understood a little bit better what was going on around me. Okay, that's what I've got for you tonight. Thanks a lot for listening. I realized, boy, this is a long video. I'm sorry it went on so long, but most of you probably did not make it to this point anyway. So I guess I feel less bad about that. All right, thanks and have a good night. Bye now.